playing piano. Last but not the least, our students will be happy to note that Professor Hart, just like you guys, also studied in male-dominated educational institutions until he came to Princeton. With this brief introduction, I'm sure that I have not done full justice. I think we cannot do full justice given the time constraint and the fact that people have come to listen to him and not to me, my introduction, which will be definitely suboptimal. I now request Ms. Sulanda Nayak to speak about INET because this is a joint venture organized by INET and also IIT Bombay. I request Sulanda to please.
Thank you, Professor Trivedi. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, that's called INET, New York, and our president, Dr. Robert Johnson, I want to thank IIT Bombay for making Samvaad a reality. In brief, founded in the wake of the financial crisis of 2009, INET is a non-partisan, non-profit organization devoted to developing and shaping ideas that can repair the broken economy and create a more equal, prosperous, and just society. So INET is a global community of economists and critical thinkers who challenge conventional wisdom and advance ideas to better serve society. To give you an idea of who we really are, I have a very, very short presentation.
The economic paradigm that existed prior to the financial crisis of 2008 essentially hit the rocks. That opened up the concerns about the crisis of legitimacy of governments. It opened up more and more concerns about how we're managing the climate. It opened up big concerns about inequality. After that sharing, you have a void. Is the void going to be filled by demagoguery and rhetoric? What didn't work well in the last 20 years is about thinking. Most people that I talk to about the economics profession can think it's essentially a marketing plan for the wealthy and powerful to legitimate more for them at the expense of everybody else. Thanks to the ideology of congressional and senatorial candidates, how medical practice is run, how education is organized. The economics profession tries to have insights that affect how all of those different things are done. And I think when economics is excessively abstract, it lends itself to use for cruel purposes. When economics is more involved in the sensitivity to the needs of humans, they aren't just money, wealth, it's simple financial categories, it gets closer to being helpful. I've often been dismayed that economists view themselves as dispassionate scientists, but the subjects, human beings, under the lens of their investigation, are assumed to be simplistic venal creatures that just pursue material wealth. And INET was formed to address the challenge. And I see the most creative elders and the most creative young people working together. And they're working out of the mold of the orthodox profession, which gives me a lot of hope for leadership in the future. It's not that much fun to just sit there and imitate everybody else and get a pat on the head. If you really want to be good in any profession, you want to be one of those people with a signature of creativity who open new vistas for people to see and see differently. Opening, broadening, funding, fostering, and showcasing the different types of work to show that economics doesn't need to exist only in that narrow way. It can be creative, it can be rigorous, and it can be relevant. It's one thing to identify what's wrong. It's another thing to have a vision and understand the people who have a vision of how to make things better. How do we change the incentives? How do we inspire conservation? And how do we manage the political economic process? How do we turn a corner as a collective, as a human race? You don't have to have your own children in some legal biological sense. You can have two kids living next door down the street or whatever and care about the future equally. I think about Inet's work as responsible to the inspiration of working with very talented and purposeful people in a realm that I think matters to the well-being of mankind.
So, Inet believes that mainstream economics has let down society at large. And that economics must serve society. So Inet brings together global thinkers and leaders to fulfill its mission. And from around the world, they come together with the same idea of serving society. And Inet also believes that India is at a stage of deep economic transformation. To this end, Inet commits to its work both in South Asia and in India in several ways. I'll just let you read down because we're a little short of time. And Inet is in partnership with a number of different institutes and universities around the country to be able to achieve this goal and its mission here in South Asia. In India, it's the Indira University. We've also partnered with the London School of Economics in their South Asia Center and produced Artha Vivad, where we take it around the country with conversations and dialogues in economics. We do the Law, Economics and Policy Conference with NIPFP, which is the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi, and it is into its 4th year now. We do the Vikas with the Center for Public Policy Research in Kochi, which is into its 2nd year, and now it's IIT Bombay, and next week we will be launching with Ashoka University. So I think this is all I have for Inet, and we are honored to launch Samvaad today. Thank you.
I request Professor Subhasis Jodi, our director, to welcome Professor Hart with a floral bouquet. May I now request Professor Oliver Hart to deliver his lecture. Thank you, sir.
tea, both in Bombay and the other ones, and so it's a great pleasure for me to speak at one, and I just had a chance to see the beautiful campus. I wish I could spend a bit more time here. I'm going to talk about some work I've done. Let's see where this is coming out. Yeah. Some recent work I've done, and I'm still very much engaged in this. The particular talk is based on an article in Harvard Business Review just a few months ago, which is co-authored with David Friedlinger from Syrio Law Firm and Kate Vitasic from the University of Tennessee. So this was actually a very unusual venture for me because here I've teamed up with two practitioners. I'm an economic theorist. I've been interested in contracts now for a long time, 35 years or more actually. You know, I build theoretical models, try to understand the way contracts work. I've never had too much contact with people who actually write contracts. And here as a result of a chance event actually, I met David Friedlinger, and he introduced me to Kate Vitasic, and so we started working together. It will become clearer as I talk what the common elements were. But anyway, I just want to say that I think it's a pretty unusual combination to have an economic theorist who creates mathematical models working with people who are in the field. Friedlinger has a day job where he is advising clients how to write better contracts. In any event, to the paper itself. So remember, it's called a new approach to contracts. So here's some background. Dell and FedEx had a contract where FedEx handled the return, when people had Dell computers and they were unhappy with them, and they returned them. FedEx dealt with both the repairs and the delivery backwards and forwards to the customer. And Dell outsourced this to FedEx in 2005, and they had a contract. It was a complicated transaction. It was a long-term transaction, and they had a long-term contract, which was a 100-page plus document, very detailed, full of statements about what FedEx's obligations were. And it sort of worked. It wasn't a disaster, but neither party was very happy with the relationship. Dell felt that FedEx was not proactive in driving improvement and innovation, and FedEx was frustrated by the onerous requirements imposed by the contract. And by about the 8th year, the parties, were just really not getting on. They were at a breaking point, and trust and confidence were at low levels. But they were both invested in the relationship. It was quite difficult for either of them to quit because the switching costs were substantial. So this was, they were in a bad spot, and the question was how could they get out of it. So what we argue is that this is not unusual, this kind of situation, and that the remedy is to adopt a very different kind of arrangement, what we call a formal relational contract, that is a much less detailed contract to begin with, but you supplement the contract with what I'm going to describe is some guiding principles. So basically the idea is that you talk to each other about what your mutual goals are. You recognize that the contract that you're writing is going to have gaps in it, it's going to be incomplete, and you build in mechanisms for dealing with contingencies that will arise and which the initial contract can't cover. And so it's important that people often talk about building relationships and so on. What's important here is that the relationship building is part of the formal contract. And I hope all of this will become clearer as I go through. So this is an alternative to the 100-page plus contract with all these detailed statements. Instead, you focus much more on what the parties are trying to achieve in a relationship, and you try to get the parties on the same page in terms of their vision, what they are expecting to come out of the relationship, and as I say, processes for dealing with unanticipated events. And we think this approach can apply to a lot of different situations. Outsourcing, as in Dell and FedEx, strategic alliances, joint ventures, franchises, public-private partnerships, which I know are a big issue in India, major construction projects, collective bargaining agreements, and I personally think that it could be extended even further, even to something like marriage. You could think of marriage as a kind of contract, and you could imagine the parties perhaps adopting some of the principles I'm going to be talking about to deal with difficult situations. Now, as I say, this approach, my friends, my co-authors have actually been putting it into practice, and a growing number of large organizations, such as Dell and FedEx, but also the Canadian government, Intel, AstraZeneca, Telia, which is a Swedish telecommunications firm, they are successfully using this approach. Okay, so a bit of background. I've been working on contracts, and in particular incomplete contracts, for a long time. Now, incomplete contracts, what is that? Well, it's just the idea that in any sort of complicated long-term relationship, any contract you write is going to have gaps. It's what I was referring to a few minutes ago. That however detailed you make the contract, it's not going to include every possible contingency that can arise, because the world's very complicated, and if we're talking about 5, 10, 15, 20, 50-year relationships, things are going to happen that nobody could have forecast at the beginning of the relationship. So the contract is never going to be perfect. Now, the traditional view is that one of the problems that arises with incomplete contracts is that when something comes up that the contract didn't allow for, the parties will need to renegotiate their contract, and at that point, each party has the opportunity to be opportunistic, because we're talking about a situation where deep into the relationship, both the parties are kind of locked into the relationship. So I mentioned this in the case of FedEx, Dell and FedEx, that there were switching costs. These switching costs may arise because of what economists call relationship-specific investments. So a classic example of this would be a power plant that locates next to a coal mine. So, you know, the power plant wants to be close to a coal mine in order to reduce the transportation costs of coal. It's going to use the coal and burn it to make electricity. And if you're right next to it, then, you know, you save on the transportation costs. Now, in advance, there could be several coal mines you could locate your power plant next to your power plant. But once you have located it next to one, you're locked in, right? You're now very dependent on that coal mine. And then there's a huge switching cost to go to anybody else once you've made the investment. So the classical view is that when something comes up that has, and you need to renegotiate the contract, one or both of the parties can take advantage of the fact that it's hard for the other party to find an alternative trading partner at that time, take advantage of that situation in order to improve their position. So the coal mine could, if the power plant needs a different kind of coal, because something unanticipated has happened, the coal mine could demand a very high price increase. Or, it's also possible the power plant to try to lower the price because the coal mine at that point might find it difficult to find another customer. So each party has the opportunity to try to change the terms of trade to their advantage. And that's kind of opportunistic behavior that goes under the name of the hold-up problem. And a lot of the literature, including much of the work I've done, has focused on this problem. But I think it can be argued that in reality, this kind of very opportunistic behavior, kind of trying to expropriate the other party, is rather extreme. And so although the literature is focused on this, it's arguable that actually, in practice, people aren't quite that bad to each other. And at some point, together with one of my colleagues, John Moore, we realized that that might be the case. And we actually, and by the way, there are ways of getting around this kind of hold-up problem that I've talked about. So about 10 years ago, we sort of switched emphasis to a different problem, and it's the one that motivates the current work, at least from my point of view. And we call this the problem of shading, or sometimes one might actually use the word shirking, which is less extreme than hold-up behavior, and it refers to something a little different. So even if your contracting party isn't going to try to take advantage of you once you're in the relationship, what might happen is the following: that when some contingency comes up that the contract didn't allow for, there may be a genuine disagreement about how to respond to it. And so you might feel that one way of responding is reasonable or fair, and I might feel that something else is reasonable or fair. And we may have to compromise, but neither of us may feel entirely happy with the compromise, and so there can be some bad feeling that is generated. So I just want to emphasize this is less extreme than hold-up, but it can be nonetheless quite serious. That in revising the contract, because there are no rules of the game as to how to do it, some dissatisfaction may be created, and at least one of us may feel that somehow things haven't turned out fairly. And how would we respond to that? Well, what Moore and I argue is that we might retaliate. We might feel less cooperative. So again, we wouldn't retaliate in some really extremely opportunistic way, but rather we would retaliate perhaps in a more subtle way. That, if I feel that you were very reasonable to me, then next time I could provide you with some information. I might think, well, you know what, I'm not going to bother. It'd be very easy for me to do it, but why should I? Because he wasn't very nice to you, or she wasn't very nice to you last time in that contract provision. And you might feel the same. And this is the kind of shading behavior. We call this behavior shading, because you're just basically cutting back on performance. I'll give an example in a moment, actually, which is a little more serious than what I've just described, but nonetheless in the same spirit. So this kind of shading behavior, which is retaliation or response to not feeling fairly treated, can then lead to counter moves from the other party. So, just as I'm less cooperative going forward than perhaps I would normally be if I felt fairly treated, you'll notice this at some point, and you'll respond by being less cooperative, and pretty soon we have some sort of vicious circle. So, what John Moore and I argued, actually, was that one can see the whole contracting process as an attempt to avoid this kind of negative retaliatory behavior. Okay, so I've actually said what's on the first bullet point here. Let me give another example, which I think perhaps makes it sound a little meatier. So we have an example. Imagine a supplier of engineering services submits a proposal in a competitive bidding process and wins the contract. But then, you're the supplier, I'm the purchaser. And then it turns out demand is lower than perhaps we expected, maybe even than I stated, but maybe certainly than you expected. Or maybe the scope expands, somehow I'm going to interpret the contract in a way that requires you to do some extra work. Either way, either because demand for your services is lower than you anticipated, or because the work is extra, your profits will take a hit. Now, you might come to me and ask for some adjustment in the fee, but maybe I won't agree to it because I think that this is all within the terms of the contract. So, what might you do? Well, you may shade, but actually you may do something which I think is closer to perhaps shirking. That is, you will not just hurt me by not giving me some information that you could easily give me, which might be helpful to me. But what you might do is, next time, you've taken a hit to your profit, so you look for some way to recover your profit. So you might decide that instead of putting the expensive A team on the job, which you currently have, you're going to switch to the less costly C team and put the A team somewhere else. And the contract is incomplete enough so you can do that. It's going to hurt me, and in this case it's going to actually help you, because of course you can have your expensive A team making profits on some other deal. And you do it because you feel, well, you shouldn't have had to take that hit to your profits and you're going to try to recover. But this is a very negative thing for the relationship. And in fact, the benefit to you may be far less than the cost of you of not having the best team on the project. Okay, so that's the sort of background for my theoretical work over the last 10 or so years. But then it turns out that while I was, and John Moore and I were doing this theory in our offices, with no knowledge of the real world, of course, like most academics, it turns out that there were practitioners, David and Kate, who were doing something like this in practice. That is, thinking of contracts the same way. They recognize that this problem, I'm going to put it in my terms, that incomplete contracts can lead to people misunderstanding each other later on in the relationship, being disappointed in what's happened, and then doing retaliatory things, and the relationship becomes sour. And they were looking for a practical way to overcome this, and they came up with something that they call the vested methodology, that tries to make sure that people are on the same page about how the relationship is going to materialize, how it's going to progress through time. On the same page both at the beginning and throughout the relationship. So essentially what you're trying to do is to avoid misunderstandings, avoid bad feelings later by various methods, which I will describe. And so this vested methodology seems to, I mentioned some of the parties that have used it. In fact, 57 companies have employed it, some of them less famous than the ones I mentioned. And although the results have not been tracked for all of them, many have reported that this approach has worked extremely well. So I just want to say at this point, then, you've had some theoretical work explaining what could go wrong and how misunderstandings can lead to shading behavior and inefficiencies. And then you had, on the practical side, people realizing that there was a sort of better way of writing contracts which avoided bad feeling. And then we sort of teamed up, and that's led to this Harvard Business Review article and some other work I will mention. Now, what I'm going to do now is just go into this in greater detail by means of a case study. So, okay, so this is, I mentioned the Canadian government was one of the entities that I mentioned earlier, and this is about them. So this involved, one piece of the Canadian government, which is the Vancouver Island Health Authority, that has, which is in Vancouver, as you can imagine, and had a contract with a group of hospitalists, South Island hospitalists. Now, hospitalists are doctors who work in hospitals, right? They see patients inside hospitals rather than, general practitioner or primary care physician who sees them in some office outside a hospital. And in this case, the hospitalists were providing inpatient care for patients with the most complex medical issues in British Columbia. And I think this contract had been going certainly before 2010 it started. And it's another example where actually things didn't work. And at some point, it was another case where, in fact, there was a lot of tension in the relationship, and then they adopted this new vested approach. Let me mention something that went wrong, which is actually not on the slides, but it happened in 2010. So they have a standard sort of contract where you have the lawyers come and try to anticipate as much as possible and put a lot of detail into the contract. That was the approach they used, and it didn't work. And here's something that happened. In 2010, there was a change in the law such that general practitioners, which is what they call them there, were no longer allowed to see their patients inside the hospital. So previously, when a patient went to hospital, their physician would follow them and at least do some of the treatment in the hospital. Okay, that's the way it used to be. And then the law changed, or the rules changed, and these general practitioners were told, no, you don't do that anymore. Which meant, of course, that the doctors inside the hospitalists had much more work to do. Now, there was some provision in the contract to allow for more hospitalists to hire, but it wasn't enough. There wasn't enough flexibility to offset the additional workload. Okay, so what actually happened was that the hospitalists became extremely stressed with the extra patients they had to see. And what they did at some point was they were so stressed that they decided the only thing to do was to stop admitting people from the emergency room. So when patients went into the emergency room, then the next step was for them to go into the main hospital. But the hospitalists, some hospitalists had to say that was okay, and they refused to do that. Because actually it was an interesting ethical situation. They felt worse about patients who were transferred into the hospital, whom they didn't have time to look after properly. They felt worse about that than not admitting them in the first place from the emergency room. So that's what they decided to do. But the Vancouver Island Health Authority were not very happy about that, and so there was a lot of tension and anger and so on. And that was the state of the relationship. And by the way, I think that's a great example of a problem with an incomplete contract, because their initial contract didn't anticipate this change in the rules or the law. So when the Vancouver Island Health Authority told the general practitioners, you can't go into the hospital anymore, that wasn't a violation of the contract, because the contract was with the hospitals, because the contract didn't anticipate it. So they were within their contractual rights. And so, but the workloads went up, as I said, and what did the hospitalists do? They shaded big time. Actually, what they did, it was more like putting the C team on rather than the A team. They tried to recover some of their time, okay? Their workloads had gone up, so they then took an action to reduce their workloads, which was not to admit people for the emergency room. But that was a very costly action for the patients actually, and for the Vancouver Island Health Authority. So there was a lot of inefficiency as a result of this initially incomplete contract. Okay, so in about, after this happened, the parties found out about this vested approach, and they decided, well, going forward, why don't we try that? And they actually worked with one of my co-authors, Kate. So here's how they did it. Step one of the approach is you lay the foundation, which is, so some of this sounds like very sort of business schooly sort of stuff, which people like me normally, actually, to be honest, laugh at. But it all sounds very fanciful and too good to be true, but actually, no, it seems to be true. It's not too good to be true, it's actually true, according to my co-authors, and I've actually interviewed some of these people, and they seem to what they say supports this. So in step one, you create this partnership mentality. You create an environment of trust, and what they do, and you talk about what your goals are from the relationship. So actually, for economists, this makes a lot of sense because instead of thinking the relationship is a zero-sum game, the more I get, the less you get, one realizes, look, there's some surplus to be created here from our relationship. There's a pie that we're going to create, and then we want to maximize the size of the pie, and we want to divide it up in some reasonable fashion. So actually meeting and talking about this can help to get everything to work. And in this case, they chartered a team of 12 administrators and 12 hospitalists to design the contract, so 12 on each side, and each individual worked with a counterpart from the other organisation to establish connections in key areas. So that's step one. Step two, there's some overlap. Step one here is you are, I think it's sort of, you're doing what I just said. You talk about what's your shared vision and objectives. What are you each trying to achieve from the relationship? What can you jointly achieve? Vision and goals. You talk about these things. And the thing is, what you do is you try to ensure that the parties' expectations are aligned both initially and throughout the relationship. So, problems can arise, very serious ones, where we have different expectations of what can be achieved out of this relationship. Then, one of us is going to be disappointed and upset about it. Well, we try to avoid that by aligning expectations. And what they did was they had a 3-day off-site meeting to craft their vision, and they further established 4 desired outcomes that flow from the shared vision and subsequently 7 goals and 22 tactical and measurable objectives. Well, that's just for this case. Step 3 is to adopt guiding principles. So, as I was describing, what I call shading occurs because one or both of the parties feel unfairly treated. So in the example of the doctors' workloads going up, they obviously felt, well, this isn't right. It may be within the terms of the contract. Nobody's breached the contract, but we don't think it's very fair for this extra burden to fall on us. And they reciprocated with this negative action of not admitting patients from the emergency room. So basically what you're trying to do is to avoid that kind of problem arising. So the guiding principles are an attempt to do that. So what are they? Well, there are 6 principles that my co-authors use. Reciprocity, autonomy, honesty, loyalty, equity, and integrity. So essentially what this means is that when something like the rule change comes out, by the way, the change I mentioned about general practitioners no longer following their patients into hospitals, this was a Canada-wide change. So it wasn't the Vancouver Health Authority that imposed this. They just followed it. But this was an unexpected event. And the point is, with these principles, the parties, and in this case, the health authority, the Vancouver Health Authority, because they've agreed to be equitable and loyal, and fed and all these things, like part of the guiding principle, then when they're thinking about how to respond to this, they would put themselves in the position of the hospitalist, as opposed to just looking at it from their point of view. That's the point of the guiding principle, that it's actually going to affect decisions you make, because when you've agreed in advance, not just to be self-interested. Okay, this is actually, I think, quite consistent with the bit of Sunana's presentation that I heard about. Was that the president of the, I couldn't quite solve because they were sitting here, but yeah, this idea that economists have focused to a large amount on, to a large extent on material wealth and also self-interest and so on. Not everybody does it. There's been quite a shift in the last decade or two. But this is part of that. This is saying, people are not just self-interested, or at least if they are naturally, they can be made less self-interested, partly by agreeing not to be in advance, by adopting these guiding principles. So just to mention a few in this particular case, under reciprocity, the parties highlighted the need to conduct ourselves in the spirit of achieving mutual benefit and understanding. Under equity, they acknowledge the unavoidable imbalances that arise in contracts. We are committed to fairness, which does not mean equality. We will make decisions based on a balanced assessment of needs, risks, and resources. So the thing is, the whole idea of this is that by sort of solemnly agreeing to these things, and I put emphasis on solemn, it's part of the contract. And that's actually my thought. I think it's very important that this should be part of the formal contract. Partly because it could conceivably be enforceable in the court of law, but I think more importantly, because when you put something in a formal contract, that means it's serious. And you really agree to it, seriously agree to it. And then later, if one of us feels that the other party is violating the principle, one of these principles, they can go and say, look, you agreed to this, and I think you're violating it. And the other party may actually change their behavior. This is something that I know from interviewing some of the people in these deals. They actually say this happened. People were willing to change their behavior, and it was pointed out to them that they were violating the principles they'd agreed to. Another important thing about these principles are that they are fundamental social norms. They're things we're all familiar with. And that's why we think they have some special status, that they can be activated through ex ante and ex post communication. Okay? We're all familiar with things like equity, loyalty, honesty, integrity. I mean, they're things, So when we agree to them, we know what it means. Okay, step 4 is having set the foundation of the relationship, you then hammer out the terms of the deal, and everything's got to be aligned with the guiding principles. And then the claim is with the right mindset, the development of the contract becomes a joint problem-solving exercise rather than an adversarial contest. In the island, El South Island deal, pricing has always been a sticking point, but the vested methodology, including the guiding principles broke the impasse, you want to stay aligned, right? So it's not enough to have all this communication before you write the contract and agree to the guiding principles. You have to make sure that alignment continues during the relationship. So the way these parties did it was that they established governance mechanisms, again, as part of the contract. Island Health and South Island created 4 joint governance teams to live into the relational contract. Each team meets at regular intervals to review progress against the shared vision, goals, outcomes, and measures. The contract also specifies a second governance mechanism, a 2-in-a-box communication approach, in which an administrator is teamed with the hospitalist for each of the 4 governance teams. So what that means is, if I'm a hospitalist and I have a problem, I know that who to go to on the other side to sort it out, and that person has agreed to talk to me. Okay, and that apparently is very important. Now, here's an example of something where they feel, that things were sorted out in a way they would not have been under the old contract. So obviously, we don't have an apples-to-apples comparison. We can't, it would be nice, but we can't say, well now, let's replay the situation where this new law is passed about general practitioners not going into hospitals. But now, under the vested methodology, all the guiding principles, let's see how the parties would resolve this issue. We can't do that. What we can do is we can look at something that did happen after the new kind of contract was signed, and that was that Canada passed a law legalizing medical assistance in dying. And this was already on the cards, I think, when the new contract was signed, but there were too many unknowns for it to be made part of the contract. However, they had the principles. They had all this discussion and principles to appeal to. And so what they did was ex post, the sustainability team came up with a pilot project to address how to incorporate fairly the additional scope of work and new role for healthcare into the hospitalist schedule and pricing model. So the point is that with this medical assistance in dying, it was again a case where the hospitalists had an extra job. They had more work to do. The question was how to rearrange their schedule so they could do it, how much more to pay them and all that. And this is something where the feeling was, and we have quotes from hospitalists on this, that in the past there would have been a lot of argument about this. But instead, with the new approach, there was a spirit of how can we accommodate this new reality given our statement of intent, and things work quite smoothly. Okay, so just to summarize then, the approach is to, if you think of, go back to Dell and FedEx with this very long contract with all these clauses, and with all respect to the lawyers here, including Amanda, who's a lawyer, and I'm sure there are other ones, when you ever look at one of these contracts, and you can't really understand it, it's incomprehensible. I've been in legal cases. Most recently I was in a case involving Apple and Qualcomm. They had a very elaborate contract. I had to opine on various aspects of it. But I could sort of understand some of it. But, there was all this looked like mindless stuff. I couldn't, detail. I'm not sure anybody really understood what it all meant. Okay, instead of doing that, how about something simpler, where you recognize, as I say, that you can't anticipate everything, but you have some basic things in the contract. So this is not about getting rid of contract. Having there's some things in the contract which are important, and you put them in. But then you say, okay, but for all of the rest of the stuff, we're going to rely on things like guiding principles as to how we're going to deal with the things not in the contract. That's the basic idea. And we call this a formal relational contract. But let me just say, we don't think this is for everybody, because it's quite costly. All the stuff I've talked about, meeting for 3 days here, setting up all these governance teams, having all this communication, I know who to call and all this, and talking to each other so that our expectations are aligned. This is not a costless business at all. It's quite costly. So you only want to do it if the normal approach doesn't work. And sometimes the normal approach works just fine. A simple contract where we don't have to talk to each other, it works well for simple transactions. So you have to ask yourself, when you're looking at the transaction, is this approach the right one for this situation? And the answer is it may be, it may not be. We think it will often be the right approach in complex, long-term contractual relationships. Okay, now I have a second paper, I just flagged this. Friedlander and I have a more analytical paper, with a model in it, more discussion of more cases, not just the hospitalist one, but other cases as well. It's on my website. The Harvard Business Review article can also be accessed on my website if you just go Oliver Harvard. Oliver Harvard. You'll find both things. So if you just mention that if you're interested. That's it. Thank you very much.